California natives, or those who have lived here for most of their lives, have a relationship with water. Of course, we don't have to be reminded of the amazing Pacific Ocean, but then also there's the shrinking reservoirs of water. And those are only two factors of this phenomenon that basically is all over our daily lives. Water is just there, present, life-giving and sinister, magnificent and threatening at the same time. We have to know how to safely and carefully live with water. There are instructions for pool safety, which are important to learn and to adhere to. Now, safety around rivers, lakes, and oceans is quite another story. There are riptides and currents and marine life and many other factors that play into those kinds of places. Again, we do our research, we learn, we study, and we adhere to the rules because safety is vital. Because there are laws of nature, rules for safety are fairly easily compiled. Everyone knows it would be foolish to think about laws of nature being unpredictable. They simply aren't until they are. Which brings us to our scripture text. We can debate until we are out of breath about whether these laws of nature defying incidents recorded in our scriptures are absolutely factual, or whether the purpose of including them doesn't really depend on scientific fact. What is important for us is that they are included. Therefore, they mean something to every reader, regardless of the century in which those readers find themselves. It's up to us to find that meaning. Much of life seems to trudge along without requiring conscious effort. We can live parts of our life almost on autopilot. At least that's how we often perceive it. We're quick to learn and to adapt and to create habits around which we order our stability. But if we think about it, which days of your week went as you had planned them? Just in this past week. Well, I had scheduled everything out really neatly, and then there was one cancellation after another, and then there were interruptions, and then the dates were changed, and then I had to opt out of something that I had wanted to go to, so that made changes. And I'm sure you could tell a similar story. Some changes are actual disappointments, and others are gifts. At times, change demands everything of us. We feel pushed and pressed and brought nearly to the breaking point. What should have happened didn't. It's in these times of uncertainty, loss, challenge that we have an opportunity. We can choose to take note, to become mindful. In the first text, the words spoken by the Hebrew leader Joshua are these: come close and listen to Yahweh's words. And in the Matthew text, Jesus calls out, be encouraged, it's me, don't be afraid. If we dig a little more deeply, we realize that Joshua and the ancient Hebrews had anything but a placid life. Joshua was a brand new leader, having taken over for Moses, who had led these people for 40 years. Now that's a transition. Because they had wandered most of these 40 years in the desert, these people were hungry for permanence, for home. But instead, the chapters preceding the text that was read contain espionage, negotiations between spies and a woman in enemy territory, and a first strategic challenge for this brand new leader. Would he move forward or would he hesitate? Their journey had brought them to the banks of the Jordan River. Now what? No boats, no bridges, no barges. That's when Joshua speaks these words, come close and listen. This is how you will know that the living God is among you. And then he talks about water. Water was about to be turned on its head, so to speak. Now, if we're familiar with the Hebrews' history, we'll know that this wasn't the first time that water had presented a challenge. Water had always been a barrier until it wasn't. Water had been predictable until it wasn't. Water was a threat until it wasn't. This is how you and I will know that the living God is among you, among us. We will face an obstacle that is insurmountable until it isn't. You will assume you know and you follow the rules, and those rules work until they don't. You might bend and crumble underneath the feelings of inevitability until you don't anymore. What seemed so predictable suddenly wasn't. So fast forward to the text about Jesus and his followers. Life with Jesus in first century Palestine definitely was not predictable. Jesus could talk with his followers about rules and responsible boundaries, about healing and about mental health. He could tell a lot of stories to make a point, and he could scold his critics for expecting proof for everything, all in the matter of a few days. So much going on every day, it feels dizzying to us who observe. About the time we seem that there will be a little lull in this nonstop action because Jesus was going up to the mountain to pray, and the followers were heading out the lake on a boat. Right then, the next drama begins. There's a wild storm, and these guys knew storms. The lake they needed to cross regularly could be whipped up by a wind at a moment's notice. No warning at all. And they didn't have meteorologists to warn them of what weather was brewing either. The storms they faced scared them. They truly feared for their lives. They battled. They bailed water out of the boat. They tried to stabilize this vessel on the turbulent water. They knew water. They knew storms. They knew this didn't look good for them. The night wore on, and they were exhausted. To make matters worse, they saw an apparition ahead of them just as the sky was turning into that tinge of sunrise or dawn. An apparition. It looked as if somebody was walking on the water. Now, as we sit here in our safe, dry seats, it might be hard for us to imagine that kind of terror, but try to put your mind right there. They feared for their lives. And now something inexplicable and otherworldly came to add to their fear. It's no wonder that they screamed. I think we can identify. Haven't we all been in tight, uncomfortable, unpredictable places only to wonder if our minds are playing games on us as well? So then we begin to doubt our own sanity and in the middle of an existential crisis. We know this place. When they scream, something very unexpected happens, and it catches them completely off guard. A voice calls out, "Be encouraged, it's me, don't be afraid." What? Can you imagine them looking at each other and going, "Did y'all just hear that? What was that?" It doesn't take them a whole lot of time to recognize what that was. They knew it was Jesus. And it's at that moment they knew that this would not be their final boat ride. It was Jesus. Peter, the impetuous one, was the first to respond. Of course he was. "If it's you, Jesus, order me to come to you on the water." I can just imagine the rest of the people in the boat saying, "Okay, what are you talking about? Don't you know water? If humans could walk on water, we wouldn't have been frantically trying to salvage this boat and get to shore. We would have just stepped out and strolled to safety. Water does not support humans walking on it until it does. Jesus says, sure, come on over. It's great out here. And all is well for a moment until Peter suddenly realizes what he's doing. And that is enough to sink his water-walking adventure. You can't do this, he tells himself. And then he can't. This mind game will fail once you come to your senses, he thinks to himself. And then it does. The threat I can see so far surpasses the assignment in front of me, he rationalizes. And then it does. I am not advocating for mind over matter this morning. If you find yourself in a hard place, a really tight spot, a place where water is just threatening to submerge you, I'm not here to lay a guilt trip for having too little faith. I certainly do not believe that we can think ourselves out of a bind or that we can expect predictable, neat, divine interventions that fit our expectations. I also don't believe that we can always suspend the rules. I'm not advocating for that. But I am inviting us to think about situations that are beyond our control, times that feel threatening, frightening, careening towards an outcome that could be disastrous. In these times, we can be certain that what we see isn't all there is. Even the most mindful, spiritual, aware people cannot come close to recognizing the vast possibilities that God can lead us to and through. There have been many times in my life where I couldn't see the shore, so to speak. The ambulance is there just in time. I didn't know if I'd make it to the end of the month and if I'd be able to pay my rent. I had a choice to make. Would it be food on the table or gas in the car? Or maybe just a little of both? And I'm still in a place where I do not know the outcome of some of my close relationships. I don't know. In the pull of those times, there is immense pain and fear and uncertainty, but that pull instinctively is always towards what it looks like to us, to what the most likely outcomes will be. When we look at the events in our lives, or when we imagine what people who are evicted or living unhoused or losing a loved one to gun violence go through, we wonder, how do people get through? How do entire populations, such as Indigenous people or Black Americans, come through? How? Are there times when water is turned on its head for people in what to me seems to be indescribable situations? I'm reminded of an interview Chris Hayes did with Ta-Nehisi Coates this week. Maybe some of you saw that. Mr. Coates spoke about the backlash against Black Americans at various points in our history. And then he made this statement, and I quote, "These backlashes generally come and are most ferocious when those who would like to maintain the status quo are most afraid. I take it as a sign of strength," end quote. Wow. What is remarkable to me is that the people who come through the most egregious experiences are often those who see most clearly and who exhibit the most hope. I will not lay that burden onto someone and demand hope of them. I can't do that. However, hope and faith and stamina in a place of the darkest horrors causes me to question, where can I learn perseverance courage and a strong conviction that God has more options than I do? Where can I learn to take a step into threatening waters knowing I may not make it to the other side, but I just might? What can I expect when I'm called to put my feet into the water, into a place that has always acted like water, expected like water, or like money, or like a diagnosis, or a relationship? What do I do with certain expected outcomes? Do I limit what happens, what can happen? Or do I allow for the possibility that water acts a certain way until it doesn't? People will respond predictably until they don't. Our communities will continue to be ravaged with gun violence or racial hatred and backlash until something happens that changes this trajectory. These biblical narratives aren't primarily here to give us exact historical events just as they happened. They're here because they mean something. We read and consider them in search of that meaning. So if we find ourselves in a place where we expect the worst, believe that nothing can change, can we all just step back and covenant with one another to hold space for a confounding resolution? Can we allow for a way to shore through this turbulent storm that we had no way of anticipating at all? For all of us who are figuratively confronted with a massive, raging body of water, I invite us all to consider Joshua's call. Come close and listen to Yahweh's words. And then to hear Jesus shout over the howling wind, be encouraged. It's me. Don't fear. We too can be witnesses of how water, predictable water, can somehow be turned on its head. May it be so.